We've got some breaking news this morning. Israel has agreed to daily 4-hour humanitarian pauses in northern Gaza to allow civilians to flee. Now, this shared by the White House this morning. They say there will be no military operations in these areas over the duration of the pause and that this process is starting today. Now, meanwhile, a new poll also out just today finds that almost half of Democrats disapprove of President Biden's response to the Israel-Hamas war. According to the new poll by the Associated Press, NORC Center for Public Affairs, Democrats are less supportive of Biden's response than they were in a similar poll conducted in August, when 57% of Democrats approved of the response and 40% disapproved.
In an interview with Politico, Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister of Israel, accused current leader Bibi Netanyahu of suffering a nervous breakdown, causing him to miscalculate over Gaza. He accuses Bibi of being a danger to Israel. According to a new report in Huffington Post, families of hostages taken by Hamas are urging Israel and the U.S. to prioritize bringing their loved ones home over seeking revenge. Here at home, congressional staffers staged a walkout in protest of their boss's rejection of a ceasefire in Gaza. Meanwhile, over 100 Democrats on Capitol Hill penned a letter Wednesday to President Biden calling on him to protect Palestinians in the United States. They want the president to implement temporary protections that are intended to shield immigrants from returning to countries torn by natural disasters or war. So what do you make of these 4-hour humanitarian pauses, specifically framed as enabling folks to flee?
Well, I think it's interesting to show that we were able to exert some influence over the Israeli government. I'm sure this 4-hour pauses are not going to make a meaningful difference or, frankly, satisfy people who are very upset about the bombing campaigns and think that they should end entirely and there should be a ceasefire. But it does show you that maybe we can get more of a commitment to implement whatever policies we want from the Netanyahu government if we really try. Or maybe this is just trying to give the U.S. well, okay, here, fine, we're doing 4-hour pauses. It doesn't really make a difference, but we're doing them. If the region is still being torn apart by bombings, good that they're going to get some humanitarian supplies in, but it doesn't really seem like it's getting at the real problem. I'm interested by this poll. Now, obviously, the way we framed it, if almost half of Democrats disagree, that still means, well, then more than half do agree, right? But the trajectory of how Democrats feel about how Biden's handling this is, important and relevant to his approval ratings and his possible reelection. He needs to hold the entire coalition together to possibly get over the finish line next year. And if disaffected Democrats, including Arab Americans in Michigan and other places, are just dissatisfied, even if overall most Democrats still agree with what he's doing, that could be enough to cost him reelection.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of tacit admission, this 4 hours a day to flee. One thing it brings to mind is that apparently there are maybe no 4-hour gaps in the bombardment, and that's the conditions that the people of Gaza have been living under. It also brings to mind the early days when Israel averred that it was allowing people to flee down a humanitarian corridor. This word humanitarian gets attached to things that sometimes don't seem in retrospect very humanitarian, because what ended up happening, people who were fleeing along that very humanitarian corridor were also being bombed by the IDF. So I am curious to see whether or not there are useful humanitarian efforts that can be made during these pauses. There was a video that was circulating around yesterday showing members of the IDF commandeering a water tank, taking a water tank out of Gaza or from a community in Gaza, at the same time that humanitarian efforts are trying to get water, clean water into Gaza. People obviously don't have water to drink. People are experiencing all kinds of stomach problems because they're drinking mixtures of saline, salt water and other kinds of foodstuffs to try to make it go down more easily. There's no clean water to treat wounds. There are people, children with open burn wounds that are very prone to infection because of the sanitation issues, not to mention obviously that they don't have antiseptics and other kinds of medical supplies on offer. So obviously it would be a benefit to this really despairing population if some humanitarian aid were to be able to get in. But it seems really counterintuitive to say, we're going to pause so that you can help around the margins, while we immediately thereafter are going to keep bombing and being the cause of the humanitarian crisis in the first place.
Right, and U.S. tax dollars are paying for both the bombing and the humanitarian effort. So we're destroying things and then paying to rebuild them. We're maiming people and then paying for their treatment. We're starving people and then paying for their food. Is that really serving? Is that a good use of our funds? And is that serving American national security, which should be the point of our spending on foreign policy? I think people will be increasingly dissatisfied. I think if people understood better that that was the reality, that this is being done, the weapons are the money we give Israel, substantially, partially, and then also the U.S. is the #1 contributor to the aid fund. So we are on both sides of this. Why?
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting to hear the family members of the hostages say they're not interested in revenge. They're not interested in this continued bombardment. They're more interested in getting their family members home. Hamas reported that 60 Israeli hostages have been killed by Israeli airstrikes so far. You know, who knows what those numbers are going to hold up. But even the possibility that Israel's own attacks could have been killing almost a quarter of all of the hostages that were taken in the first instance really raises some interesting questions about, you know, we've been saying, well, does Israel value Palestinian lives, the innocent lives of people of Palestine? Well, do they value the innocent lives of the Israeli citizens who are being held captive in Gaza as well? What is actually the point of this if it's not to get the hostages back? And in all of the putting up of the posters and the empty dinner table set for hostage victims, is that ultimately performative? And not from the family members, I believe they're deeply invested in that. But are people weaponizing the hostages in a performative way when their policy advocacy is not at all tied to getting them home safely?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult situation. They're being held hostage, and the people holding them are, you know, happy to go to the grave using them as shields. So I don't know what to do.
Yeah, in fact, I'm glad you raised that. There was an editorial cartoon that was making a similar point in was it the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and it caused a lot of controversy. I mean, it was a physical manifestation, of exactly this argument that's being made, that ultimately all of the lives lost, whether they're the babies that are pictured there, or whether it's the woman, or whether it's these Israeli hostages themselves, which are obviously not pictured in this particular rendition, that it is somehow justifiable, I guess, if you look at that image and your response is to say, okay, well, to get the Hamas guy, we absolutely should gun down the 4 children and 1 woman that are affixed to him. I mean, it's a really interesting question. And I think this cartoon was meant to make that argument that you're making. But I think a lot of people looked at it and said, well, it's actually illustrating why killing all of those innocents to get that one guy actually isn't a good policy approach.
Well, we will continue to monitor updates in this situation, and we'll have more Rising right after this.